Hello, and thank you for joining our Restoration on the Half Shell program, day 2 of 3. I'm Corey Miller, Director of Community Resilience for the Coalition to Restore Coastal Louisiana. Today, we will cover some of the prominent issues regarding our coast that recur in our news media. We will do so via 3 presentations by leading environmental journalists. This will be followed by a panel discussion with the audience, moderated by Amy Wold, Director of Communications for the Water Institute of the Gulf. First up, we have Bob Marshall, a long-standing journalist of coastal issues in this region. He will speak to the topic of addressing climate change and the implications for our coast. Next, Mark Schleifstein with The Advocate will provide an overview of recent media coverage of the Mid-Barataria Sediment Diversion and the current opportunity for the public to weigh in. We'll wrap it up with Tegan Wendland, WWNO Coastal Desk reporter. She will discuss the topic of retreat and relocation for our coastal communities. Each presenter will be followed with some time for audience members to ask questions and discuss their topic. And at the conclusion, we will have the panel discussion with all 3, led by Amy Wold. We hope that you enjoy and ask some intriguing questions. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Bob Marshall. I do columns for The Advocate, the Times-Picayune, on environmental issues with a focus on coastal Louisiana, which has been my home my entire life. And you know, Louisianians can take pride in our 50-year coastal master plan, which is recognized all over the world as one of the most advanced science-based climate adaptation plans anywhere. And if we get the funding and build all the projects on time, it gives us a real chance to save many of the communities, industries, and jobs south of I-10. But there's an important caveat to that ambition. That is the success or failure of this plan, a plan that still has 36 years to go. Well, the success or failure of that plan will actually be determined in the next 8 to 10 years. That's because of the unexpected rapid acceleration of sea level rise caused by greenhouse gas emissions, mainly carbon-based fuels. When that plan was put together in 2007, the engineers and the scientists put all the facts together into the computer. And the computer said, you know, if you get all the money and build all those projects on time, in 50 years, by 2067, you could be building more land than you're losing in aggregate in just 50 years. We went, yay, we can live here. That's great. The plan is updated every 5 years, now every 6 to 7 years. So 5 years later, in 2012, scientists did the same thing, put all the new information in, the engineers put all their new information in, and the computers said, hey, you can still do that. If you get all the money and build all the projects on time, in 50 years, by 2067, you could be building more land than you're losing. Timing's important. Why? Because the hole we've got to fill keeps getting deeper and wider all the time. So we're like, good, we're on the right track. We can get this done. We can save most of what's left. 5 years later, the 2017 plan came out, and the computers had some bad news. We can no longer win that race. In fact, it said, even if you get all the money, the $92 billion you're looking for, even if you build all those projects on time, by 2067, you're still going to lose at least 1,200 square miles of your bottom third, maybe as much as 2,800 square miles. So what changed since 2007? The amount of heat-trapping greenhouse gases the world has been pumping into the atmosphere. These gases trap heat. The oceans absorb the heat. What happens to water when you heat it? It expands. So instruments have been showing the oceans rising. What happens to water stored as ice on land? If you heat it, it melts. It runs downhill into that same pot, further increasing the amount of sea level rise. Tide stations and other scientific instruments have been measuring how the seas have been rising at the fastest rate in more than 2,000 years. They've risen 5 times faster in just the last 10 years. If that rate continues, much of what we hope to accomplish in the master plan for our $92 billion will either be underwater or have a much shorter lifespan than we originally expected. The red areas on these maps show just how much of the land we currently live, work, and play on will be underwater in just 46 years if we continue to pump greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. This isn't what we expect to happen at the distant end of the century. This is what's going to happen in just 46 years. The best case is we'll have to move plenty of people. The worst case is we'll have a full-scale migration before the end of the mid-century point. We'll be moving communities, businesses, jobs, key industries, including fisheries, and energy will begin to collapse because we can't get out there to work on the infrastructure. And for fisheries, the habitat that supports our fisheries will be turning to open water, the marsh. What the facts on the ground and the evolving evidence-based science are telling us now, what we didn't know 15 years ago, is that saving even some of our bottom third now depends on rapidly reducing emissions over the next 8 to 10 years. So I have two messages for the public to think about. The first is you need to vote for legislators and congresspeople who pledge to make reducing emissions by any means necessary the #1 priority for their time in office. Because that really is the only way we can save some of our bottom third. It's clear the science is in the report, the 2017 report, and by the way, that report was approved unanimously by our state legislature, which is, of course, dominated by the Republican Party. The second thing I want to urge them to do is to urge the state to do a cost-benefit analysis of all the projects they were beginning to build now through the end of that plan, the initial phases of that plan through 2067. We only have one chance to get this right because the seas are rising and we're sinking. And we need to know how many of those projects will be above water after 2067. How long will they last compared to what the original project lifespans were considered before emissions caused sea level rise to accelerate at this rapid rate? We need them to do that, and we need them to do it now because we'll only get one chance to spend our money properly. And if the unfortunate happens, and those cost benefit plans say we're not going to get the benefit back for the money we're spending, then we need to move to plan B and C and D and E, whatever it is, to save as much as we can. That's what we need to talk about beginning now during these conferences and going forward. Thank you.
All right, Bob. This is Corey Miller with CRCL. I had one question for clarity that I was personally interested in. When you speak about the need to press for cost benefit analyses or cost benefit of the plans, can you help the audience understand how that goes perhaps above and beyond the current process of the master plan to reevaluate its projects every now 6 years and to reassess which projects are going to be the most beneficial to hang on to as much land into the future? What, in other words, what do you see as above and beyond what the state is currently doing along those lines?
Well, I'm not sure exactly what the state is doing. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not sure exactly what the state is doing. I've asked the CPRA about this a couple of times over the last couple of years and said, have you done a cost benefit analysis on these projects? What do we get back in terms of the ecological services, storm surge protection, if that's possible, fisheries production, etc. And they said they haven't done that. So I don't know what they're doing, to be honest with you. Maybe someone else knows, but I think what we need to do is have it clear cut that, I mean, we're really on the edge now, right? Their own plan, and most of the scientists studying climate and sea level rise say that, you know, the future decades from now, 2067 and beyond, will be determined largely as far as sea level rise in this century by how much we reduce emissions over the next 8 to 10 years and going forward. So no, I don't know what they've done. They did a future without action cost. In other words, if we stopped doing everything today and went no further with the master plan, this is what the economic impact would be. That's not the same thing as cost benefit going forward for projects that are scheduled to be finished or near completion in 2067. Many of these projects, of course, are designed to be refurbished, continued even after 2067. Obviously, there's operation and management, for example, of the sediment diversions that we're trying to build. We know from recent computer modeling how much land, wetlands, we're expected to build at Mid-Barataria. So we'd like to know if sea level rise continues to accelerate at current rates and at projected rates, what will be the return on that investment of O&M on, say, Mid-Barataria going beyond 2067?
Thank you. We do have a question here from Anonymous. Feel free to type in your name, anyone who's listening, if you want to be identified for future Q&A. But someone asked, what legislators are known to be coastal friendly at this time? That's a pretty large question, but I don't know, how would you tackle that one?
Well, they all claim to be coastal friendly. No one's for flooding the coast, but you have to check their votes on things like regulations for reducing emissions. I would especially point at our congressional delegation, people like Steve Scalise, even Garrett Graves, who once headed this program, who are doing everything they can to fight in the past and going forward any regulations that would impose industry to reduce their emissions. So yeah, I mean, you have to watch what bills come up. They're all will tell you they're for the coast, but what are they doing as far as signing on to the governor's program to come to maybe what's so-called zero emissions, excuse me, in 30 or 40 years. Not zero emissions, but zero carbon equation in 30 or 40 years.
Here's a pretty interesting one from Raymond Sweet. Has anyone looked into the bank accounts of our politicians to see if there was a net positive after a pro oil and gas vote? I think, yeah, go ahead.
Well, you can go to, there's some websites you can use, and one of them's, I'm skipping on the name right now, but most of our congressional delegation have received hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years from oil and gas. When I was still with the Lens, I was looking at campaign contributions to state legislators on key committees, excuse me, and surprisingly, oil and gas was not among the top contributors. I think it's really kind of goes beyond that. I think they're under the assumption, they keep getting reelected, and they're under the assumption, and so are voters, that oil and gas in particular, which is, that's our conundrum, right? We produce oil and gas, carbon fuels, and yet we think that's a major industry in the state. But if you check the figures in coastal parishes, for example, oil and gas is not a major employer. In fact, tourism and hospitality employs many times more people than oil and gas. So they don't really have to spend that money because they basically the that voters hire people who are pro oil and gas and opposed to regulations. I might suggest people who want to understand why this happens is they might read a book called Strangers in Their Own Land, which is a deep dive into Southwest Louisiana oil and petrochemical country, understanding why these people are in fact voting for people who become policymakers who are actually promoting policies that are against the state's coastal survival.
Excellent. We had another question that came in from Michael, but it seems like that's going to be good to save for the panel discussion at the end. So let's go ahead and queue up the next presentation by Mark Schleifstein. And please keep the questions coming.
Welcome. I'm Mark Schleifstein, and I'm a reporter with the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate, and was with the old Times-Picayune dating back to 1984 when I came here. We're going to be talking about Mid-Barataria Diversion and its draft environmental impact statement, and what the public needs to know about that process and about the things that are being looked at. And I should tell you that as early as 1984, when I got here, one of the first hearings I went to, public hearings, was an environmental impact statement for the 3 freshwater diversions, Carnarvon, Davis Pond, and what was supposed to be one along the Bonnie Carey Spillway. So a lot of these issues have been looked at for quite a very long time. The idea of actually creating a diversion to capture sediment to rebuild land really started bubbling up in the 1990s. Was actually originally proposed by Percy Viosca back in 1925. So it's something that's been around for quite a while. You can see behind me a picture of the Mississippi River looking out towards the Gulf of Mexico and those wetlands all chopped up in front of it. And we're going to be using these backgrounds to sort of talk about some of the issues that are going into it. So as the first thing we should talk about is the impact statement request and permit request. The permits are needed both for what the Corps calls dredge and fill. You're building a project that's going to be dumping sediment into open water, and that requires a permit under the Clean Water Act. But it also requires permits because you're going to be cutting through federal levees and federal structures, and both of those need the approval of the Corps. One of the issues, obviously, is that everybody is looking at is, and this is a picture of the BP explosion behind us, is what the effects were from the BP spill on the Barataria Basin. And that is the reason the trustees are supporting this project. They contend that the reconnecting the river provides a long-term process for rebuilding wetlands in this area that will eventually compensate for some of the damages caused to wetlands by the BP oil spill. So those issues are fairly significant, obviously. One of the things that comes out of that, though, is the question of, well, does it really have the ability of doing that? And one of the key issues that they're looking at happens to be the effects on dolphins. This is actually a picture that we took after the BP oil spill of a dolphin being tested for damage resulting from the spill. Reports that were produced for the environmental impact statement suggest that the diversion itself, its fresh water especially, will result in significant damage to the population of about 2,000 dolphins that live in the Barataria Basin. The hope is that somehow you can get dolphins to be retrained to get out of the area. There's no real money that's being put into that, but there is money being put into both addressing the effects on dolphins as they do occur as part of the economic money that the state is going to put up for mitigation for this project. So the other key issue, of course, is fit, and that continues to be the biggest issue that's out there. There's no question that fish are going to be fisheries, commercial fisheries especially, are going to be significantly injured by this present commercial fisheries because of the amount of fresh water that is being that would be put into the Barataria Basin. It will change the kinds of fisheries that are available there. At the same time, recreational fisheries based on those traditional fisheries, or I should say traditional in terms of the 20th century and the 21st century, but not prior to that, there will be a change. There will be more freshwater fish available in those areas, and so there will be changes that will occur over time. The other issues that are involved here are the actual development of how this thing works, whether or not it is able to capture enough sediment to actually build land over time. The environmental impact statement says it's expected to build about 23 square miles of new land in the first 30 years. And during that period, that 23 square miles represents new land that is created or saved during that time as sea level rise continues to occur. And that sea level rise will occur beyond the 30-year period, so that by the time you get to 50 years in, it will be 17 square miles estimated for the size of land that will be built. That's still significantly more than would be there if no diversion is put in there. Now, the other question is, opponents of the project contend, well, why not just continue to build land using dredging of the Mississippi River and pumping that stuff through pipelines to rebuild lands directly? Well, the key issues there are, first, a lot of those projects that are already part of the coastal master plan actually make up about 2/3 of the restoration half of the master plan. A lot of those projects are built into this environmental impact statement. The sediment diversion actually will be, quote, nourishing those new wetlands as well as any remaining existing wetlands by the lighter portions of the sediment that flows into the Barataria Basin, moving on top of those wetlands and filling them in. The problem is that the wetland creation projects, those marsh creation projects, really only have a life of about 20 years before they begin to quickly disappear because of natural subsidence and storms and other things. And the contention is that if you restore the wetlands abilities to capture sediment in the long term, you've got a better chance of doing that. Now, you see behind me this picture of ducks with the New Orleans in the background. One of the key issues that the environmental impact statement poses is that all of these projects will be reducing the potential for damage in the future from storm surge, both in terms of the levees that are out there now, the existing post-Katrina hurricane levee system, and expected future improvements to that levee system are already in the those are key issues. The other significant issues that the environmental impact statement is attempting to address is what effects this fresh water will have when the diversion is operating, in terms of the potential for flooding of communities both directly below the diversion on the east bank of the Mississippi River and above it, including John Lafitte community. The contention there is that, yes, there may be some minor effects that actually will cost some money. And there's a significant chunk of money that is available for mitigation, and those mitigation efforts would include elevating roads, elevating docks and homes to deal with that potential for water. The contention there again is that the effects of the diversion in the near term will be more than would occur if the diversion is not built. But the farther out you get into the future, the more chance the sea level rise itself will actually overwhelm the effects of the diversion itself. So at 40 and 50 years out, the water heights along those communities are expected to be pretty much the same as if the diversion were operating, even when the diversion is operating. So it's sort of a question that's still going to have to be answered as we move forward. And I think those are most of the key issues.
So, Mark, I wanted you to expand a little bit on some of the expected shifts in fisheries as salinities shift with the project. That's kind of one of the most prominent topics that we're seeing in the news and media. Could you just help to understand, what are the species that might have the most challenges? What are the ones that might have the most benefits? You need to unmute, Mark.
I got you. So the first one is, come on, Mark. I am having a horrendous problem. Hang on a second. The first one we have to worry about are the clams, the oysters that are in the basin, and those oysters are being grown on water bottoms owned by the state of Louisiana that are rented out in 15-year leases by the state. And the people in those areas that are close to the diversion are going to be directly affected by the fresh water. It's basically going to kill their oysters. The state has been looking at ways to find other places farther down in the basin to create new oyster beds that would be able to switch out leases and things like that. So that's a potential long-term way of dealing with that. The second key one is brown shrimp. The freshwater will is probably going to result in a delay in the movement from juvenile to adulthood by those shrimp. So those shrimp will be farther out in the bay and farther away from the place where the fishermen are able to catch them. So they'll have to go farther to catch them. And there's a chance that they'll be younger and smaller when they're caught. So that's another significant problem. Not as much with white shrimp, apparently. Not quite sure why, but it's more timing than anything else. And then you get into the different finfish types, and it's a similar sort of a thing. The fish aren't killed, but they tend to stay out of areas with lots of fresh water, and so you end up going farther out to catch. The result of that, what the state is attempting to do is try to find ways of mitigating for those problems, largely through working with fishers to install refrigeration units on boats and other things, and there may be some buyouts as well. The environmental impact statement points out that no matter what happens, there are going to continue to be significant problems in the basin with fisheries, just because of both the combination of sea level rise killing more and more of the wetlands, and that resulting in there actually being more fresh water in the upper part of the wetland basin, causing similar sorts of problems. So that's I think I pretty much got that straight.
Thank you. And we have another one here from Raymond.
Okay,
are you saying? Yes,
before you do that, you need to correct something that was in the video, and that is that the estimates actually are 27 square miles after 30 years that would be created, and 21 square miles after 50 years. So just I was too low in my estimates.
So are you saying that would be a total of 40?
No, it's not a total. It's after 30 years, 27 square miles. But then at 50 years, sea level rise will result in additional losses, so it'll only be 21 square miles total.
And
that's the biggest problem of facing the entire basin, is that what we really don't know yet is what happens after 50 years. You go out 100 years, there could be even less if nothing's done to reduce emissions.
To tie that back to what Bob hit on, which climate scenario are we looking at there? Because there's a wide range in what's going to be available depending on how aggressively we address that fundamental issue.
And they're using the same one that was used for the 2017 master plan, which is sort of a middle to high, but not the highest level for sea level rise, but it's still pretty significant. It's a problem no matter what's going to happen, and you can see that if you look at the 50-year maps that are in the 2017 Coastal Master Plan of expected losses without the project, which show lots of red going way up into the basin.
Thank you. All the more reason for us to really aggressively try to address the root causes there, to give us the best chance to hang on to as much land into the future. Raymond comes in swinging hard again, and just
so no point to the diversion.
Are you saying that there's no point to the diversion?
I am not saying that. I am saying that with the diversion, we are reducing. We're increasing the amount of time that is available for people to live in Southeast Louisiana, especially behind the levees. And that's, we need to take these things into account, all of them at the same time. There's, if we had an unlimited pot of money, if the leprechauns were here and able to provide us with enough money to actually pay to mine the river every year and pump it in, obviously that would be the choice. But there are going to be things that are going to result in us not being able to do that. The first one is that the state's already got 2/3 of the money that they're putting aside for restoration in that pot of money for those kinds of projects that they're going to be doing. These diversions are aimed at long-term, cheap, continuous supply of sediment from the Mississippi River, just the way it used to be, at least in a limited fashion. And without that, it's just going to be really problematical. Okay, I'm not hearing you.
I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to talk there. I think we lost the end of it, but I think we got the gist of what you were saying. Thank you very much, Mark. We're going to go ahead and shift on over shortly here in just a moment to the final presentation. I did want to say, though, at the end, we're going to show some content, a slide that has some information about how the public can find out more about the DEIS, more about the Mid-Barataria Sediment Diversion project, and we're still under a window of public comment period on that. And so we're going to show that slide and send some information as well in a follow-up email. But let's go ahead next and send it on over to Tegan Wendland. Thank you.
Which is industry, the environment, coastal restoration, the ports, the oil and gas industry. It pretty much encompasses everything. And one of the things that I report on a lot is what I kind of think of as the ultimate adaptation, moving away from the risks that climate change, sea level rise are bringing to the state. When I started reporting, though, retreat, as we call it, was kind of what I thought of as a dirty word. It was restore or retreat. It wasn't restore and retreat. And it was something that I kind of avoided saying on the radio and was really cautious about bringing up with my sources when I was interviewing people who live in coastal Louisiana. It was a very uncomfortable narrative, especially coming from someone like me who's a transplant. I'm from Wisconsin originally. And it's hard for me to imagine my home ever washing away. I've seen trees cut down and turned into a cornfield around my mom's house, but the land will pretty much always be there. So I can't understand the emotional weight of making such decisions. It's been something I've been very sensitive about. But our desk has also really tried to push that conversation forward by pointing out that whether or not we want to talk about it, retreat is already happening here on Louisiana's coast. It's just happening in sort of an unmanaged way. And I try to focus a lot on what that means for our coastal communities. It often means that lower income people are left behind with fewer options. They're not able to afford to move to a new location, to move further north, and they're not necessarily receiving assistance to do so, even if they wanted to. And so some of my reporting over the years has looked at how, the state is becoming more and more aware of this issue. And it talks about it to an extent in things like the Coastal Master Plan, but sort of using coded language, partly because this has been such a tense point of conversation. And so in the most recent master plan, you'll see terms like voluntary acquisition and non-structural projects. And those words mean relocation and buyouts. Some of my reporting has looked at how the state's kind of intentionally tried not to tell folks that they're going to be facing these decisions someday, because officials have told me they don't have the money to help. And so they don't want to freak people out. They don't want to tell them their homes are in unviable locations and they'll be forced to leave because the state has, held the line that they can't afford to pay for those people to leave. So I did a big story with Reveal, the Center for Investigative Reporting, and NPR a couple of years ago, where I interviewed some folks who were very interested in leaving, but didn't have the funds to do so. And then I really pressed the state on where they estimated these homes were that needed to move, or needed or were eligible, should be eligible for buyouts because of the riskiness of where they were located, and the fact that even if the state were to fully fund its coastal master plan, it won't be able to save the entire Louisiana coast. Some people will inevitably flood again and again. And the state provided me with the data that they used in the coastal master plan to come up with those estimates, which were just numerical at the time. And I worked with the data reporters on that team to map out where some of these folks' homes were. And so you can see Ollie Williams was one of my sources. and where her home is on the North Shore in Slidell, and then Malcolm Lacoste, a shrimper down in Lower Lafourche Parish, and where his home is on that map. So these are some of the proposed buyout areas that the state was saying, you know, these homes were unviable, but we don't have the money to help people move. Now, since then, the conversation has really changed around relocation. Ile de Jean Charles, of course, became the first big high-profile case here in Louisiana after receiving a substantial grant from the federal government under the Obama administration to relocate about 30 or 40 miles north of their current location, which is washed away substantially over the past 100 years, and build a community where many of the families from the island are now looking at receiving new homes. And it might feel unprecedented, but really Ile de Jean Charles is joining many other communities across the nation over the past decades who have grappled with similar things. I know I said in Wisconsin, I don't worry about the land disappearing, but we certainly worry about this. And so here's an example from my hometown area. This is Gays Mills, Wisconsin, picture of what it used to look like, a cute little stereotypical Wisconsin downtown. Picture of what it looked like in the summer of 2008 when we had some pretty historic river flooding, and then a picture of what it looks like now. FEMA funded a relocation of pretty much the entire town, and the folks of Gays Mills moved up the hill to higher ground, a little bit further away from the river, though they left the downtown intact and they still enjoy it as much as they can. And so I think more and more relocation is being celebrated as a solution by the news media. And I think that goes hand in hand with the way that state officials and federal officials even are starting to talk about this. LA Safe, which was a project executed by the Office of Community Development here in Louisiana, really carried that conversation forward with a number of community scoping meetings they held a few years ago, where they met with community members and really brought them into conversations about what solutions could look like in their communities. And as part of that, a number of buyouts were proposed. I don't know that they're funded yet, but it came out of community conversations. And now there's even more money coming through the Office of Community Development for a couple of parishes. St. Tammany and Vermilion parishes are receiving about $20 million for elevations and buyouts. So I think we're seeing this come a lot more into the public conversation, which is a good thing. So there's been some research on what our future is going to, a lot of predictions, researchers about how we're going to see continued migration away from coastal areas. One of these studies came out a couple of years ago by Matt Hauer. There's an article depicting some of his findings. And he's a Florida State University, and he's a Florida State University professor. And he found that, as we've seen with past migration patterns, cohesive communities will kind of stay close to one another, and we'll probably see migrations to cities that are fairly close to the coast. You know, you're not going to see anybody from New Orleans moving to Canada, but we might see influxes in nearby cities like Birmingham or Atlanta, but there's still a lot of unknowns. What we do know is that after every storm, people are moving. I talked to a bunch of folks in the Lake Charles area after last year's hurricane season who, you know, some of them have moved north a few times already, and some are moving even further. I talk to these folks all the time, and a lot of them explain to me, you know, how they feel like they're not getting help. And I think we'll see people continue to move. I'm really interested to see what the latest census data shows us about migration patterns in the lower parishes here in Louisiana. Hopefully it'll in more granular detail what I'm already hearing in my reporting. But now I feel like I have maybe a different R word to contend with, and that word is refugee. It's a word that a lot of people who are in these situations kind of find uncomfortable. They don't maybe necessarily feel like refugees, especially climate change refugees, when these situations are a bit more nuanced than that, especially with Ile de Jean Charles, for example, where the majority of the land loss that they've experienced on that small island has had to do with oil and gas canals carved through the marshes, eroding over time. And just a very small amount of that land loss could be attributed to rising seas associated with climate change. And so they bristle at being called climate change refugees. And I think refugee in general sort of oversimplifies, and others, people who live on the front lines and who are facing really challenging decisions about their future. And I think as reporters and advocates, we're tasked with finding ways to empower the people at the center of these narratives and to not victimize them, and to explore the nuance of this sort of unprecedented time.
All right, thank you very much for that, Tegan. I have a question. What do you think it will take for people to further embrace the strategy of relocation as an adaptation from land loss, sea level rise, increased storm and flood risk? It seems like you've hinted that we're kind of on the right trajectory, but what do you think is kind of the next major push to get us to I don't know, perhaps embrace more of kind of like the Netherlands culture?
I mean, the way that we talk about it as reporters is important, and that's why I'm kind of making a case against using victimizing terms like refugee. But I think also in community planning, it's really important to bring communities into the conversation. And so that's why I talked about LA Safe and those scoping meetings that they held, because I think that's a really great example of involving communities in the decision-making process and empowering them to be part of what that future looks like. And that was the intention with Ile de Jean Charles. It got very messy, and there's lots of local politics going on with that project that have kind of made it complicated and given some of the people who are participating in it pause, and some folks aren't participating in it anymore who were. But you know, if this is going to be a model for how relocations are going to look in the future, they're going to be messy and complicated, and there's going to be politics, and there's not going to be as much money. That's something Pat Forbes told me directly when I went down to visit the new site for Ile de Jean Charles, what they're calling the New Isle. He said, you know, we're glad that we're able to do this. We wish we didn't have to. And the one thing we know is there's not going to be this much money for future relocations.
Thank you. We have a question that I was holding from Michael from earlier. He asked, can you speak to your perception of the extent to which the CPRA is planning for coastal retreat / migration and or non-structural protection?
I mean, I did a little bit in the presentation, and Mark might be able to add more to this. Yeah, Mark, if you can say more about what funding is available. I know that the Office of Community Development has set aside $10 million each for the 2 projects I mentioned for buyouts and elevations, but that's a pretty small handful, and that they have a much more involved idea of what this could look like were it fully funded. But I don't know of a lot of other opportunities for buyouts.
So non-structural, which is what we're talking about, is this stupid Army Corps of Engineers word. And it really has come out of the Corps trying to deal with the continuous requests to build levees. And what they've done is they've been very clear in saying there are areas we're not going to build levees in, but we are going to put together a project that will include a non-structural component to it that will be elevation or relocation. And that is happening right now with Southwest Louisiana. It's happening in Slidell. The Slidell project that they're working on as part of these 3-year proposals that they're looking at. Also, Upper Barataria is another one that their non-structural will be considered as part of that. It was supposed to have been looked at for West Shore Lake Pontchartrain and St. John and St. James Parish, but I don't think it ever got very far. But the reality is that there's a disconnect between the funding for those, which have to be done through Congress through a Water Resources Development Act project, and the reality of the push on the individuals to get out. And that reality is the same one that got King Milling to become an environmentalist back in '98, where he started seeing that he couldn't issue loans as head of Whitney National Bank to people living outside the levee system because they couldn't get insurance. And that is happening again. And that's really going to be the indicator. It's, people are not going to be making this decision on their own. They're going to be making these decisions based on what the insurance industry is going to be doing with that. And there you get the state legislature involved and you get Congress involved. And Congress is going through it right now. They still have not rewritten the flood insurance program from really post-Katrina. And those things will directly affect what's happening in Louisiana. And
thanks for jumping in there, Mark. Maybe I should have saved that for the full panel. One thing that I've picked up on, Tegan, that I know you've dealt with, and you touched on this a good bit in your presentation, but could you perhaps expand upon the sensitivities about going into these communities that are faced with these really, really harsh decisions, and more so not, I guess more so maybe kind of like a little bit of a note to others who may have a desire to go down to Ile de Jean Charles and try to interview people or try to collect data and just how that your experience with the gravity of having those conversations with community members, and any tips on how to do that sensitively, if there is a way to.
I mean, be invested. I think that folks tend to trust reporters who are sticking around. And it's hard every time you have a natural disaster, a flood. I mean, it's happening right now in Baton Rouge and Lake Charles when reporters fly in and they ask what seems to be an obvious question, which is like, well, why do you live here? Why don't you move? And that's just incredibly insensitive because a lot of people don't necessarily have that option. It's not that easy to pick up and leave. And a lot of folks are, maybe they're living in a trailer home, or maybe they don't have flood insurance. Maybe they're not, getting a big payment from the National Flood Insurance Program after their home floods, And so I think that there's a tendency as reporters to really oversimplify the narrative in order to make it like sexy and easier for people to understand and, want to click on. And I think we need to examine that as reporters and whether that is really, serving the greater public.
Thank you. And I believe we have a couple more questions when we get to the round robin with Amy here shortly. I think we're going to go ahead and shift gears and kick that off. There was one that just came in that I'll go ahead and push to start off and then pass the baton over to Amy for a group discussion with all three. But so we have a question here from JK. I assume the three journalists all live in South Louisiana. Can you talk about the challenges or alternatively the advantages of covering Louisiana's coastal land loss crisis when you are part of the story, since you are affected by the wetland loss, by damage to fisheries, etc.? And Tegan, if you want to go ahead and jump in first, if there's anything else you want to expand upon that, and then I'll pass it to Amy to do the navigating for the rest of the full panel discussion.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'd like to hear my colleagues answer it too. But I am stressed out. That's how I handle it. Last year my power was out for 10 days after Hurricane Zeta. I was live on All Things Considered nationally, reporting on the storm as it was unfolding with two different phones because the power's out on the one phone and I might go out on the other one. I mean, I'm stressed out and I'm invested in this place, and I want to do reporting that serves my community, and I want to answer people's questions about whether they should buy a house, how to get insurance, where they should live, how to navigate these decisions. But I'm personally facing the same ones. I mean, I've been looking at buying a house and asking a lot of questions in that process. So yeah, the stress is real. I guess That's my answer. I have a lot of feelings about it, and I don't ever really turn off, you know.
Thank you very much. And I forgot to say, I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Amy Wold. She's with the Warner Institute of the Gulf, their communications director, but I'll let her give a little bit more of an introduction to the audience, and then pass that question perhaps to the others and take it away from there. Thank you so much, Amy.
Thanks a lot, Corey. Hey, everybody. I'd love to hear the answers from Mark and Bob next. Mark, what do you think?
Well, let me ask Bob. Bob, you want to tell the story, or you want me to tell it? You know the story. You're muted.
For some reason, I was gone. I was gone for a minute there. I don't know why. Tell it, Mark.
Okay. So after Katrina, there was and the things that happened thereafter. There were some serious questions about what would happen with the newspaper and who would still be around. And by 2012, when that decision was made for many of our colleagues, it really became a question that we were asking each other, which was, why are we still here? In the terms of, in terms of journalism, but also in terms of what's happening in our community. And I made a very clear statement to our staff that I planned on sticking around because the risks that Louisiana was facing, and especially the New Orleans area in the aftermath of Katrina, was something that I felt was important enough for me to continue working. And Bob said, "Thanks, I'll retire."
Well, it's that. Well,
but he didn't. He didn't retire either. He just went off and did his thing elsewhere.
Yeah, well, this is a story that I've lived, maybe more so than, the other people on this panel, since I was a boy, a young man, hunting, fishing, seeing what was going on. And I think it provides a great advantage to a journalist who knows the turf, or the wetlands, as it were, and knows the people. And so on the other hand, which you have to avoid doing as a journalist is not letting your emotions get in the way, your biases perhaps, of reporting the story. And that's one reason I'm not a journalist anymore. I'm a columnist, and which is a lot easier in many ways. But it's really hurt, and it was extremely frustrating watching. A lot of the communities we're talking about now, having them becoming invested, and the state reaching out to them to talk to them, to basically in many cases, drag them into the process. And I can tell you, I've been writing about this and the impending crisis, that was approaching for 30 years, 40 years. And it was just ignored, basically, by the people who were going to be impacted. And that's not really unusual. It's when it's right against you and it becomes, as they say, a kitchen table issue with your livelihood, with your ability to pay your mortgage. That's when people finally wake up. But there have been people in agencies broadcasting this to the residents of the lower part of the state for decades, and now they're finally coming face to face with reality. And for many, it will just be too late, frankly. And the point brought up by Tegan and Mark, I think it was the last plan, the 2017 plan, it was suggested that a new chapter had to be added for about $6 billion. I think that was the price tag, put it on in 2017 to begin non-structural, which I hate that term too, basically raising people, flood-proofing homes, and moving some, which gets us back to the discussion of, what's the cost benefit on some of these things we're trying now. I think, anyway, yeah, so it's been a great advantage being a native, living this story, just as it was after Katrina. But on the other hand, as a journalist, you have to be very careful not to let your emotions, overwhelm the facts of the story.
So if I can jump in there, one of the things that's been frustrating to me as a journalist is that as we move forward with the Mid-Barataria Diversion program, one of the things that keeps getting lost is this underlying reason for this project being there, and that is that it's going to reduce the amount of money in the future that will be spent on raising levees around New Orleans. And we already have a dollar amount for that, which the Corps, proposed last year, which was $3 billion to be spent over the next 50 years to elevate the levee system just to keep it at a 100-year level, which the Corps contends that, they already say that's not enough because it is considered a high-risk levee system in their ranking nationwide. And the reality is that 200-year system or 500-year system would most certainly result in the city being able to withstand, survive into the 22nd century. And that's what we really need to start worrying about. I see there's also Raymond Sweet has a question about, well, gee, isn't there some way of dealing with that issue? And yeah, there is. John Day, professor at LSU, has proposed filling in the city of New Orleans. You use the you use the Bonnie Carey Spillway sand to elevate the city. And that's a huge project that I doubt anyone is ever going to get the ability to do, but that's basically what's being done in the Netherlands. And the difference is that we do not have that same ability of getting Congress or their legislature to pass something, because our legislature, our Congress, represents the entire United States, not just Louisiana and not just New Orleans, where the Netherlands legislature just deals with the Netherlands, and it's, everybody there is at risk of flooding, so everybody is looking in the same direction. So that's one of our major problems.
Thank you very much, everybody. One other question, kind of curious, what do you find is the hardest thing to communicate or the hardest thing to get people to understand as you're covering coastal issues? And I'll start with Tegan. Do you want to start off?
I guess that for me, that New Orleans is a coastal city. I feel like a lot of our listeners think of coastal issues as being something that's playing out down in Plaquemines or Lafourche or whatever. And I feel like more and more people in the city are starting to realize that, we're experiencing lots of local flooding here and that those things are related. But I'm always trying to find ways to remind people that issues that are playing out on the coast are happening in New Orleans too. And New Orleans is a coastal city, and subsidence is an issue here, and flooding is an issue here, and sea level rise is an issue here, and that the giant hydrous system that we've built around us is not necessarily going to protect us from the heavier precipitation, those bigger rainstorms that we're seeing, the water coming from up above.
How about you, Bob?
Getting them to understand that this is an existential issue, especially for this landscape, their children. You can, the NOVEL.com website is a pretty good example of the frustration I feel. And that is, unlike the printed edition of the Advocate and the Picayune, readers decide what goes on that website. The clickers. The website is designed hopefully to make some money, and they do that by getting people to come. And so it's really the youth, the people who are deciding what's the most important news on that homepage at the top of the page. and it's never, you know, maybe Drew Brees sneezed or LSU beat Alabama, or there's someone was shot or whatever. But it's very seldom these stories, and on the same, so that tells me that the great mass of people out there, and I run into this all the time, they just don't want to hear about it. And, you know, if they did, they would be insisting that they elect people who become the policymakers, who make these decisions on addressing, for example, emissions. That would be their #1 priority. And it isn't. So that's very frustrating. And because the science keeps reinforcing just what's going to, the decision, that the deadlines we have here in the next 8 to 10 years. And, you know, laissez les bâtons rouler. You know, I mean, that's basically a very frustrating thing to run into.
How about you, Mark? It's your turn.
Okay, so I will avoid both of their answers and go with something completely a little bit different, and that is that my frustration right now is this lack of disconnect between having to save oil and gas jobs and not understanding that carbon reduction will be creating more jobs than oil and gas has. And some of those jobs are going to be exactly the same as oil and gas. And they're all well paying. And that really, you know, I'm having that problem, not just with the public, but within my own newspaper, understanding that, making sure that people understand that. So we know it's a problem. Moving forward, you know, I'm trying to find time to write about that while covering everything else that's going on, including every single time it rains. So.
What do you think?
Often tied to the same problem.
This is true. So kind of building on that, what do you think is the biggest story that's going to come up in the next year or two?
Who is that for?
I will start with, I'll start with you, Bob. I think I can give your answer, but go.
The biggest story for the public will be who becomes the Saints quarterback. I think that's probably #1. What LSU does with their new quarterback as well. But as far as this issue, well, I think it's going to continue to be Mid-Barataria. I think that's captured the public's imagination. And I think it is a good kind of an icon, if you will, for getting more people aware of what's going on. You know, on a broader scale, I think the biggest story will be how much of President Biden's legislation and executive orders dealing with emissions actually make it through Congress and actually begin to work. The mechanics of those things begin to work so that we know we're on a path to reduce emissions in this country and hopefully be a leader. You know, that's the things affecting this. I think probably for our readership in this issue, it's going to be just really focused on Mid-Barataria.
And I'll jump in and go back to what I was talking about before. And I really think that there will be some significant proposals coming out of the governor's Climate Initiatives Task Force that will be game-changing for the state to at least address that the legislature will have to actually finally face about quite a few of these different proposals for reducing emissions. And that's going to be a, you know, it really is going to be a huge story, and it's going to be very difficult for us to all cover because it's all fairly new, and the disconnect between that and the coast is still there.
Thank you. So what, and you've both kind of gone into this. I think we lost Tegan for just a little bit, but she'll be back. Both of you kind of touched on this question, but I'm kind of curious of what you see as the best and worst case scenarios looking at Louisiana for the next 30 years. And you can focus on whether it's the coastline or whether it's what our, just kind of what we'll look like. Because sometimes people think we're going to look like just like we look now. So kind of best and worst. What's the best we can hope for?
Go ahead, Mark, you take it first.
Well, I hate to say it, but the best that we can hope for is a significant reduction in the remaining wetlands along our coast. There will still be more wetlands to our west than will be in the Barataria and Terrebonne basins, because they will continue to be losing wetlands fairly dramatically, even with all the efforts that we're going to be making. That's one piece of it. The other is the all bets are off scenario, which is my greatest fear, and that is that we get another Katrina and it hits New Orleans directly. And if that happens, all bets are off. If New Orleans is flooded by a real Katrina as opposed to the Katrina that did it, even with the brand new levee system that is built properly, and it does flood, even if it's, even if it's 5 or 6 feet of water in the city, there will be serious questions asked about the future of New Orleans. And that really is serious questions about the entire coast, because you can't have a coast without New Orleans.
Best and worst, is that what you're saying, Amy? Well, the best case in 10 years would be as Mark said, it'll be a matter of maybe we don't lose as much as maybe the rate of loss drops. There's some indication and some of the recent research that perhaps sea level rise, we may be entering a cycle where sea level rise, for many different reasons, isn't as high or as rapid. That the other would be that Mid-Barataria is actually working. It's open and people actually are seeing, I think it could be done, Mark, maybe best case scenario in 6 years, 6 to 10 years. The gates could be open. It could be flowing. Maybe people will see that. But I think in general, the worst case scenario, I hate to put it that way, but I think everyone knows we're on a downward slide. And, people often ask me, what's going to be like here in 30 or 40 years? I think with the caveat of obviously the city being flooded by another hurricane, because I agree with Mark on that, if that happens. But I think worst case scenario would be that the state continues to its unrealistic and unjustified attachment to the dying oil and gas industry, that Texas steps in to be the leader in the onshore development and production of offshore wind energy, that we let that window close because of this very small tail wagging the dog of the oil and gas industry, that we ignore this opportunity that's there for us, that the governor's task force, which a lot of it's focused on carbon capture, that doesn't produce the programs we need to tell the rest of the country we're ready to take this next step. We're an energy state, not just an oil and gas state. That would be the worst case scenario, in addition to obviously major hurricanes, or for that matter, major, freight train rain events that flood the city and flood everything else. So, not optimistic stuff. I know, people don't like to even read or hear about it. But we are in this, well, we can go into that, but I think in the next I think a lot of what the state does over the next 40 years will be determined by what we accomplish, what the nation accomplishes, the world accomplishes in the next 6 to 8 years on emissions reduction, and or whether or not the state finds a permanent funding source for the master plan. I think we'll know in 6 to 8 years how much coast we'll have left. If the world is not successful in dramatically reducing emissions, we know, you've seen the slides, that we're going to lose quite a bit of everything below US 90. There'll be mass migration. It doesn't matter if we get the money for the master plan. If the world is successful in doing that, but we don't get the money, the 92 billion, then the master plan will have to be pulled back because they don't have the money for the projects. And so that means we'll be basically abandoning a lot of that stuff. So the next 6 to 8 years will be critical on what happens here over the next 40 or 50. I don't expect, and I think maybe people misread a lot of the stories and the headlines on the research. No one's expecting the Gulf to come rolling in outside of a hurricane in this area, in the cities, in the next 10 to 20 years. But beyond that is when, some terrible things will happen if emissions are not dramatically reduced.
Thank you very much. And actually, one thing you pointed out is the next question we've got from someone who's watching. How can the state pay for needed restoration after there are no more oil spill monies? I know that's a $1 million question or $1 billion question. So, Mark, if you could start that out.
Wow, I wish I knew. It really is going to have to take Congress stepping in and deciding that these projects are a national economic interest. If we have that, that reduces the amount of money that the state has to put up to about 35%. But even that, where they even get that 35% from it's unclear. Now, obviously, if the state goes whole hog into wind power or some other power source offshore, that, there will be revenue sharing from that. It'll be treated the same as what Gomesa is, more than likely, and that will be helpful. But wow, that, there's just no way of knowing that how much money that will actually take. Beyond that, if you look at what Lafourche and Terrebonne Parish are doing, they're taxing themselves to build levees. The New Orleans area already has sales tax levels at that height, so that's going to be a problem for us to add pennies to pay just for coastal restoration. It's going to be a problem. So then, your other I'm laughing and I shouldn't be. Your other alternative is going to the oil and gas industry and saying, pay me now for what you did then. And there really does not seem to be a significant interest in doing that, even though those lawsuits are still out there. Who knows how much money that would raise. I would expect that maybe 15 to 20% of the actual damages that are estimated might actually result in settlements if you get beyond the question of whether or not the company should actually be responsible for things done 30, 50, 100 years ago.
I kind of agree with Mark. I mean, I think, the taxes that Terrebonne and Lafourche are levying on themselves, I mean, it's not the same situation, and it's not the same amount of money that the projects will need to protect the rest of the state. Mark's been talking in terms of New Orleans. This is really Slidell. This is St. Tammany Parish. I mean, hell, excuse me, Mandeville floods every time there's a minor hurricane now, parts of Mandeville. So, I mean, it's not just New Orleans, and people outside the city often bring this up. Well, we're paying for New Orleans. You're really paying for your own survival here as well. So, well, there's not enough money. But if you saw one of the graphics that Tegan used about where migrations will take place going forward, I've said for a long time that Florida will be the key. The property values in Florida, what's happening in Florida, even now, because like in Miami, they're on a porous limestone. Levees won't help Miami. The water's coming up as high tides get higher into their streets. So as places with really valuable real estate and with huge congressional delegations begin hitting this, that's when Congress and the nation is going to have to do something, and it's going to be one hell of a fight. It'll be the coast, as it is now on many issues, the two coasts against the rest of the country, which will be having their own problems with rising heat and rain, trying to get this country to say, we've got to pay for this. And unfortunately, we're not, we're this republic with 50 separate political entities, none of which really want to sacrifice anything of their own for another state. I really don't know how the nation's going to come to grips with this, to be honest with you. Forget about the current, nonpartisanship. I don't know. Great example, the Dutch, small Western democracies can reach, some are still very much monocultural. The Dutch always, the old saying, all noses in the same direction. This is a threat that threat is to the entire nation. So they respond. In this case, how do you do that? It's untold trillions that we're going to have to be spending if the nation is going to say, we need to come to the aid of these countries. And that's why reducing emissions now dramatically can reduce that cost going forward. And that's why it's so important. And it's, right now people are voting to drown in this state, basically, by the people they're sending to Congress. They're saying, I don't care if my kids have to wear waders to go to school. I don't care if they don't have to live here. They're voting to drown, basically, drown what they have today.
Thank you both very much, and a big thanks to Tegan. We'll definitely let her know, but thank you both for joining the discussion this afternoon. And Corey, I think that goes back to, oh, sorry, Mark?
No, thank you.
No, thank you.
Oh, no. And Corey, I think you had a few closing remarks you'd like to make.
Yes, absolutely. First off, big thanks to all of you, to our guest journalists for all their prep and work to pull this off, your willingness to jump into the hot seat and get behind the camera for a change, and most importantly, thank you all for your dedication to bringing these issues into the lives and homes of so many residents across our coast that need to be informed and need to be engaged. All of our attendees, we hope that you enjoyed our second day of Restoration on the Half Shell. Please be sure to visit our website, crcl.org. Tomorrow, we have a very exciting day planned. We will kick off tomorrow at 5 o'clock from 5 to 5:30 with a virtual open house where you can meet and mingle with some of the various community organizations that are working on these issues along our coast. Beginning at 5:30, we will kick off our program and feature 3 individuals who are making waves and leading change in their coastal communities. So you'll have an opportunity to learn about the Gulf South for a Green New Deal, hear from a community leader who runs an organization that supports local commercial fishers, and get to know some efforts that are underway to revitalize Lincoln Beach in New Orleans. Please be sure to go ahead and check out our community partners and sponsors via the exhibit hall in the Hub virtual portal. And we will make sure to send out an email to all the attendees today to show you all the different ways that you can engage in the draft environmental impact statement until that closes on June 5th, if I have that correct. All the details will be sent via email and shared to you. So actually, we'll go ahead and show you a little bit of a teaser. So it's recorded for the record, and we'll share it far and wide. And again, thank you very much for your time, and thank you to all of our presenters, journalists, and especially Amy Wold for helping to lead that wonderful panel discussion. See you tomorrow.